Hey guys, my name's Louie. I'm an addict. I used a variety of substances for about 17 years. Originally, I was heavy into weed and alcohol. Then it changed to coke for a while. Then back to weed and alcohol. I also tried lots of other things along the way. I've been clean at this point for a bit over 4 years. Getting clean wasn't easy. In this podcast, I share my thoughts and experiences both pre and post sobriety. My hope is that by sharing these things, it may help those who are transitioning from using to being sober. Like I said, it isn't easy in the beginning. Massive understatement there. It's also geared towards those who have gotten sober and who are in the maintenance phase, also known as working their program. Or perhaps it'll be helpful for people who are not afflicted with addiction, help them to understand how it works in our minds, since to them, it's pretty likely that our patterns of behavior are fairly alien. It's not something that they understand or recognize. If you're listening to this and it's helpful, please share it with others. We're all in this together, and you never know when sharing something could potentially help somebody else out. Along those same lines, if this is insightful or helpful and you're listening on iTunes, please take a moment to scroll to the rate and review section of the app, provide a rating and a review, as this will help it to reach other people. If on YouTube, like it, leave a comment, etc., etc. If you have feedback for me, thoughts, questions, ideas on topics I should cover, people I should potentially look at interviewing, please shoot me an email at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. At this point, I'm kind of on a treadmill, like I mentioned before. Eventually, I'm going to run out of things to talk about. Special request before I get started. Today is July 11th. It's the evening of the 11th. We got back today from a camping trip. I have to share with everyone that I totally got stung in the face by a wasp. It is, poetic justice and the irony of ironies. The reason for that is, for me, everything has been in the face since I was about 21 years old. Like my son falls down the stairs, and I'm like, oh, did you fall down the stairs in the face? Someone gets shot with a Nerf gun in the house. I'm like, oh, did you get shot in the face? So everything is in the face. It was, like I said, the irony of ironies that I got shot in the face, or that I got stung in the face. Anyway, I also meant to, record the nighttime sounds for you guys while we were camping. Unfortunately, we had a massive storm blow in late last night, so I didn't get to do that. All right, so topic for today. I have a lot of crazy stories. I've lived a very colorful life, and I tell these stories to people from time to time, and a lot of people find them entertaining. Now, me personally, I think the reason they're entertained is because these stories typically involve me or someone else being completely out of control, doing crazy stuff that other people who are perhaps more civilized wish they could do, but are unwilling to do for one reason or another. Maybe they're more morally scrupulous. I don't know. I think a lot of people, have probably better impulse control than I do, and that lets them stay out of trouble because of it. And they find it both funny and gratifying in a way to see someone doing exactly what they want when they want, even when it is totally out of control and has consequences. So a subset of these crazy stories directly tie in with addiction, and they're stories that when they're told, the context is that I or maybe someone else is really bad off, pretty much hopeless. These stories illustrate that the problems I was experiencing as a result of my addiction and the incidents that followed, or the consequences, if you will, are not what normal people experience. So some of these stories may seem funny or entertaining. This is actually my second attempt at recording this. Initially my thoughts were these would sound funny, but they actually come out sometimes sounding kind of sad, I think, just because they're an indicator of the illness. So we'll see how it sounds this time. If it comes out sad, so be it. I'll find some sad music for it to edit in. If these stories come off as funny, that's not exactly my intent. I'm absolutely not trying to glorify or romanticize mine or anyone else's use. I'm just trying to show the ways that my brain worked differently from normies and the behavior that it drove me to, which was, by all means, obsessive and insane sometimes. That's not a stretch of the imagination. So without further ado, I give you Normal People Don't Have Stories Like This, Volume 1. So, title of the first incident, or the first story, I should say, incident, that's funny, is the forklift incident that led to me getting fired. All right. So after high school, My first full-time job was in a warehouse. I'd gotten this job through a temp agency. And when I went to the temp agency, they had me do all the paperwork, and then they had me go take a drug test. At this point in my life, I was already smoking weed every single day. And I would drink, 2 or 3 nights a week, but not really bad. And in order for me to pass this drug test, I had to stop smoking for about a month before I even went to the temp agency. Now, because it was relatively early in my addiction, I was able to live with just drinking from time to time for that month. In other words, it was still early enough in my illness that I could still stop temporarily. Initially, I was a materials handler. What that means is, I stood on an assembly line and boxed up parts. I labeled them and prepared pallets for shipping by shrink wrapping them, and labeling them and delivering them to the shipping dock via a pallet jack. So I started working, and I knew that if I didn't screw anything up, I would get offered a permanent position 90 days in, and that would be contingent on passing another drug test. So I ended up working as a materials handler for the first 90 days. At about day 59, I stopped smoking weed again, in preparation for the 90-day drug test to go permanent. I was super excited about this job. I was stoked. You could tell that other people hated it, but I really enjoyed it. And the reason was I would work from 7 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. I'd take a 30-minute lunch. And the reason I really enjoyed it was because this was the first job where I made enough money to actually make ends meet. Prior to this, I would have to work 2 part-time jobs and sell weed just in order to pay the bills. And the reason for that was prior to this, I was in high school. So whatever methods I had to earn money, that had to happen outside of school hours. So anyway, I passed the drug test at 90 days, and I'd proven that I was reliable and would show up to work every day. So they gave me the permanent position, and they offered me a small raise if I were willing to learn how to drive forklifts. These were stand-up forklifts. You could pick up pallets anywhere from 1 to 4 stories up in the air, and I mention that because it's important for later. So as soon as I passed the drug test, I started smoking again and training to learn how to drive forklifts. I got my license within a couple of weeks, and then I started driving the lift full-time. At the time this was going on, like I mentioned before in previous episodes, when I first got hired, I was living with a buddy of mine who was a few years older than me. I was sleeping on the couch in his 1-bedroom apartment, and I'd contribute to rent and bills. And when I went permanent, like I said, this job allowed me enough money to get my own apartment. First apartment, big deal. Like I mentioned before, prior to this, I was working 2 part-time jobs whenever I could. I was in high school prior to this, so this was the first full-time job post-graduation. I'd also sell weed, and this would allow me to pay some money on rent and bills while sleeping on my buddy's couch. It would allow me to keep my car gassed up, buy beer, etc., food, So this was my first place. It was a big deal, big step. Now that I had a 40-hour work week behind me, I didn't have to work a second job, and it allowed me to afford my own apartment. And that was great because that was a huge amount of stability. Because for the last couple of years, finishing out high school, half my sophomore year and my junior and senior year, my life was super unstable, and I didn't really know where I was going to stay. And it was always a constant worry. So it was me and this other guy who drove the lifts for most of the warehouse. We would receive trucks, 18-wheelers full of pallets. We'd load trucks for outgoing stuff. We'd pull pallets for shipping, all that kind of thing. There were other people who could drive the lifts, but that wasn't their primary job. We were the 2 guys who did it all day, every day. So I called the other guy Tony D. D stood for drunk, because Tony would come to work with a can of soda every morning, and he'd fill it with whiskey throughout the day. And it was ridiculous because he'd drive around with this can of soda, and everyone knew damn well a single can of soda wouldn't last him all day, But anyway, that was Tony D's story. It was just ironic. The only reason I mentioned that is because it was ironic because, you had me, and I was high all day driving forklifts, and you had Tony D, the other guy, and he was driving forklifts every day, and he was drunk. So, again, very ironic situation there. So, whenever anyone made a mistake on a forklift and someone got injured or property got damaged, they would be sent for a drug test. They'd be given paperwork by HR saying they had to show up and pee in a cup. And usually there was like a stipulation. They would say it has to happen within 4 hours. And it happened from time to time. And a lot of time people who got drug tested, as a surprise on the fly as a result of an incident, a lot of times they failed and they lost their jobs. All right, so we'd receive pallets off of trucks. We would load them onto inclined racks. So they were higher on one end than the other, and they had rollers. So the pallets would then flow down to the end of the rack. And then me or Tony or someone else would pull them from the other side, take them to the materials handlers, and they'd sort everything out and label it and all that, and then repalletize it. When we put pallets in the racks, after they were received from the from the receiving dock, we weren't supposed to have double stacked pallets up there. And the reason for that is because they're difficult to handle, and they can get broken, they can get dropped, etc. After a year and a half of walking this tightrope, of being high, and knowing that if I made a mistake, I'd be unable to pass a drug test, and that my new apartment, which I loved, depended on my job, I came across a pallet of keyboards, and it had another pallet stacked on top of it. And the bottom pallet was stacked like a ziggurat, like a stepped pyramid, almost similar to something you'd see like in Mexico or South America. So that the pallet on top was very unstable, and it had like a small platform from the pallet on the bottom that it was resting on. So I started pulling this pallet out, and the top one started rotating while it was still 4 stories up in the air. And it fell off. No one got hurt, but a bunch of keyboards got broken, and I promptly got sent for a drug test. So this was back in the 90s. Now this had to be 2000, so late 90s, 2000-ish. This was before fake urine was readily available, before it was prevalent. So I went to the local head shop. For those of you not familiar, that's like the place where you go and buy bongs and pipes and stuff like that. And I got a bottle of this cleanser stuff. And the instructions said something like, drink a bottle of water, drink this stuff, then drink 2 more bottles of water, wait an hour, and then go take your test. And I already knew going into this that my chances of passing this damn thing were pretty low. So I drank the first bottle of water. I drank the stuff. It tasted not great and was super thick. Then I drank the next 2 bottles of water. And in that hour I was supposed to wait, I couldn't control my urge to smoke weed. I knew that my livelihood and ability to pay for my home, in this case, the apartment, which I treasured and valued quite a bit because it represented stability for me. I knew that this was all dependent, me keeping the apartment, on me passing the drug test. But I was unable to not smoke weed for that hour. So after I drank the 2 bottles of water, I rolled a blunt and I smoked it. I finished it right before walking out the door to my drug test. I promptly failed that drug test and lost my job. So I went from having a relatively stable home situation after years of not having one to having a very unstable home situation because I didn't have a legitimate means to pay for it. Normal people can control the urge to do something if it means that they'll suffer a significant consequence. I was unable to. Like I said, normal people don't have stories like this. All right, so the second story I'll tell is the way what I call it is the Russian nesting doll cocaine boxes. So while I was working the warehouse job, I was also busy further complicating my life by way of slowly getting addicted to cocaine. After I got fired, I managed to support myself by selling a lot of cocaine and a lot of weed. So I did manage to keep the apartment, but it was not by doing something that was exactly low anxiety, And when you're doing that kind of thing, when you're selling drugs, you deal with people and handle them according to how well you know them and how much you can trust them. Some people I would be unwilling to meet wherever I was staying. With those kind of people, I'd meet them at a parking lot somewhere. Some people I trusted enough and knew well enough to know that it was okay to have them come to where I live and visit me and pick up their stuff. And even then, there were rules about traffic, right? You couldn't do that all the time. You couldn't just have people coming and going all the time. But anyway, at this point, I was struggling to regulate and control my cocaine use. Things were starting to get out of hand in the sense that I couldn't control my use. And it was becoming something that I was doing more than I really wanted to and more than I was comfortable with. I realized that there was a moment between my impulse or my desire to do something and then me actually taking that action or acting on that impulse. So there's a moment between where I think taking a particular action would be nice, and then making the decision to act on that action. And I realized that if I could delay my ability to act on the impulse by putting obstacles in the way, then I had a better chance of controlling myself. So another way of saying it was that if I could stretch out that moment between impulse and executing on the impulse, I had a longer amount of time where I could potentially make a better decision and maybe make the right decision. Talk myself out of making the bad decision. In this case, doing cocaine and starting a cocaine binge. So a buddy of mine from high school calls me, and he wants to come by and get some coke. And I tell him, all right, man, come on by. So he shows up maybe 45 minutes later, and I'm in the apartment smoking the bong and drinking a beer. And, he joins me, and he smokes and has a beer with me. And obviously, he called me because he wanted to get down to business, right? So eventually he's like, so where's the coke, man? And I point to a large box in the center of the TV room. This box is the size of a coffee table, and it's taller than the coffee table. And I say, open it up. It's taped up, right? So he gets a knife and he cuts it open. And then inside that box, there's a slightly smaller box. He cuts that one open with a knife. And then inside that box, there's a slightly smaller box. And so on and so forth until he gets to the 8th box. And it's probably the size of a shoebox. And in that box, there are several bags of actual cocaine, weighed out in grams, 8 balls, quarter ounces, stuff like that. And he looks at me like I'm out of my mind. And the look on his face says, what the hell's the meaning of this, Louie? Why was this tucked away inside boxes, inside boxes, inside boxes, inside boxes? And then I explained to him, hey man, I'm trying to control my cocaine use. And I have it in all these boxes to put obstacles in between me and the coke to slow my use down. If normal people don't want to do coke, they just don't do coke. They don't have to have a Russian nesting doll cocaine obstacle of cocaine set up to avoid doing coke. Most people would maybe have realized at this point that things were getting out of hand by seeing this whole situation. Not me, not so much, Again, normal people don't have stories like this. So, I've talked about the end of the road of my cocaine addiction in other episodes. It ends up with me almost overdosing and passing out from cocaine use, not one night, but 2 nights in a row. Because, one night is clearly not enough, Yet another type of story that normal people don't seem to have. Alright, so, third story. I titled this one, Letting Rats Loose in My Place of Employment. This is actually a unique one. So, when I was around 24, maybe 25 years old, I had this office job, and I had this ball python, and she was a 5-foot-long snake, and she would only eat once a month, or maybe once every 6 weeks, and I would feed her live rats. Now, before all you PETA activists get upset, I felt bad about feeding her live rats. I tried to feed her frozen ones. She wasn't having it. She was unwilling to eat them, and I couldn't let her starve. So anyways, one Friday, she was due to eat. So she would eat once a month. And I go at lunch, and I leave the office, and I go and get high in the car, and I drive to the bar, have a few drinks. I get in the car and smoke a little more, stop at the exotic pet store, super close to the bar, and then I got a couple of rats, and the idea was I was going to feed her over the weekend. So, the rats come in a little cardboard box, right? And I get back to the office, and because it's super hot outside, it's the middle of the summer here, I can't keep them in the car, so I put the box under my desk. It's about 1 o'clock right now. At 3 p.m., I go out to the car and I get high again, right? I smoke a little more weed. I come back upstairs, and I finish work at 5. I end up jumping in my car and smoking a bowl on the way home. I start drinking when I get home, and I go about my weekend. Now, at this point, you guys are probably realizing, Louie, you forgot to mention that you got the rats and put them in your car and took them home with you. That's because I didn't. So, I have a dentist appointment scheduled for Monday morning, I spend the weekend getting high and drunk, doing what I normally do. I go to the dentist and I get my teeth cleaned, and I'm in the car heading to the office at like 9 or 9:30 in the morning. And as I'm driving there, smoking a bowl, getting high in the car, I realize that I left the box with the 2 mice under my desk, and that they've been there all weekend. So I'm unsure how familiar everyone is with mice and rats, but given enough time, and if they're hungry enough, they can totally bite through lots of different stuff. Easily cardboard, easily drywall, in some cases metal and brick, all kinds of stuff. They're like little chewing machines. So, of course, as I'm driving in, I'm worried that the rats got loose and are running a damn muck throughout the office. And this office is heavily populated by women, who in my mind are standing on their desk with their hands flat on either sides of their faces, screaming about loose rats. So I give my boss a call. And I know that if chaos is ensuing in the form of rats being on the loose in the office, that it will be obvious if I give him a call, and I won't have to ask any questions about it that are going to tip him off to my potential involvement. So I give him a call, nothing seems amiss, I let him know I'm on my way in, and that I'll be there in a little bit. I get into my cube, and I look below my desk, and the cardboard box is there, and the mice are thankfully still in there, but they've been gnawing a hole in the side of the box. So I take the box out to the car, I park my car under a tree, so it's in the shade, and I roll down the windows. It's a cooler day today than it was before, so they're not going to overheat. And even though I'm planning on feeding them to the snake, I'm somewhat compassionate. I'm not a completely heartless bastard. And, I already feel horrible that they spent the weekend in the box without food or water. So I go back inside and I start working. And I work throughout the rest of the day, as normal. And after work I go to class. So I don't get out to my car until something like 10 o'clock in the evening. By this time, they've gnawed their way out of the box, and they're loose in the car. So now I'm driving home, and I'm going down the highway at like 70 miles an hour. And I know that there are 2 live rats running around inside this car with me. And I'm wondering if I should let the snake loose in my car when I get home as a possible solution. Because, you gotta fight fire with fire, right? More animals loose in the car absolutely has to be the best solution possible. So I'm driving, and I'm thinking, and as I'm driving, one of the rats comes out from under the front seat on the passenger side. And I see him on the floorboard, and I'm driving, and in my mind I'm like, crap, he's right there. And I gotta get these damn things out of my car, and it's gonna be rough. I need to capture him, because if I can do that, then that means there's only one more for me to capture and remove from my car when I get home. So I grab a small Tupperware container I'd used for lunch that day, and I take the lid off and I throw it on top of the rat. I'm still going 70 miles an hour. Because, that's necessary, right? I can't pull over the car and take care of this. So it works for a minute, and then the rat starts pushing on the Tupperware container and moving it. And I'm like, crap, I need to put some weight on top of it. So I start stacking stuff up on top of this thing. Whatever I have in the car. I have a second Tupperware container that I flip upside down, or the opposite direction with a lid on it. I put a shoe on top of that, I put a book on top of that, I put a cardboard box on top of that, and eventually I get it stacked up high enough that I can hold the stack of crap on top of the rat's Tupperware prison, so I can hold him in place while I drive home. I end up driving for the next 15 minutes. I get home, I slip a piece of cardboard under the Tupperware, and I get the rat out of the car. And then I spend the next few hours trying to coax his little buddy out of there. All because I decided to get high on Friday multiple times and have a few drinks. Normal people are able to go to the office and go to work, and they don't have to get high multiple times throughout the day. They can make a decision to not go to the bar and drink throughout the day. They don't forget that they brought rats into their office. Then their rats don't get loose in their car. Then they don't consider releasing the snake in the car to take care of the rats. The whole thing was just ridiculous. And these things don't happen to normal people. Alright, so story 4 is what I call the potpourri wax joint. So, I'm unsure how many of you guys struggled with smoking weed, or made it a regular and habitual thing. If you were a habitual weed smoker and you developed a dependency on it, then you realize it's a little more complex to acquire weed than it is for alcohol. For alcohol, because it's legal, you can go to a liquor store or even a grocery store or a gas station at set times of the day and you can get more of it. And if you're underage, you can also often find someone who can get it for you. With weed, you have to rely on flaky weed dealers because the supply chain is controlled by criminals and it's subject to law enforcement, border control, etc. The supply can at times be intermittent. I'm sure that the whole legalization thing will change this over time, but back then, weed availability could absolutely be intermittent. Now, what happens to those of us who come to depend on weed is that typically we have a complex network of people we can get it from. Usually that is, a handful of different people who sell it. And then we have friends who have other people who sell it that we don't know. So that when things dry up with your primary dealer, or they stop answering the phone or whatever, you can call on other dealers, you can call on your friends, try to get you something. It's kind of a backup plan, a contingency network, if that makes sense. So even though you go to extremes to have alternate sources, you still have a tendency to have backup plans. And I would keep a spare bag of weed around. And then what I would do is I would save all my roaches from blunts and joints, which I smoked a lot of, and I'd save them in this jar that I called the Roach Motel. And then when my backup bag ran out, I would start breaking up and smoking all the roaches out of the Roach Motel. And then, if I ran out, I'd be relegated to scraping bongs and pipes for resin, which is totally disgusting. It doesn't even really get you high, but that's just the way it is. So, this next story deals with kind of that kind of phenomenon. So I mentioned I used to sleep on the couch in a buddy of mine's apartment when I was finishing up high school. And he wasn't a weed smoker. And we would smoke in the storage closet out on the balcony to avoid stinking up the apartment. We called this closet the crack shack. And we'd go in there with pipes, blunts, bongs, joints, all types of contraptions and paraphernalia. And we'd cram a bunch of people in there and smog it out. And of course, we didn't want the crack shack to smell like weed either. So we'd often have a potpourri candle burning in there on the floor. So one night we're in the crack shack, we're smoking and whatnot, and we have quite a large joint that we're about to light, and one of us ends up dropping it in the candle on the ground. And it lands in the hot wax, it sinks beneath the surface, and while I lament the fact that we just wasted a whole joint without actually smoking it, I quickly forget it because we have more and we're smoking other things. So the next morning I wake up and I remember the joint. And I go out to the balcony and I open the door to the crack shack and I chisel the joint out from the wax with a butter knife with the idea of saving it for an emergency. So I tell my buddy about it a few days later and he makes fun of me and tells me it doesn't matter how desperate that he gets, he would never smoke the wax joint. And he also told me that no matter how desperate I get, I'll never smoke the waxy potpourri joint that smells like mango blossoms. So I stash it away for later, and that's seemingly the end of it. Several months go by, and we end up not being able to find weed. This is before I graduate from high school, so our sources are even more limited than post-graduation, post-high school. I go through my meager backup supply of weed. Then I smoke all the roaches out of the Roach Motel. This takes me maybe 6 to 8 days past the point where I ran out of weed. And then I remember the wax joint. And I'm so desperate to get high, I end up breaking up the wax joint, which, mind you, is soaked through and through with wax from a scented candle. And I end up smoking it. My poor lungs, they were begging for mercy. And it tasted the way the candle smelled. It was gross. And the wax would bubble when I was lighting it because I was actually, melting the wax, obviously, as I was burning the vegetation. It was absolutely putrid and disgusting. But those were the lengths that I was willing to go to get high. Normal people don't smoke weed covered in scented wax. If that is the only weed available to them, normal people just elect to not smoke weed. All right. So, final story that I've got for you. Story number 5. This is hiding weed on the side of the road for your homeboy. So I have a friend. He's a total raver, or he was back in the day when raves were still a popular thing. The whole 9 yards. He'd wear the baggy jeans. He would spin fire on chains. He had the lights that flashed and the pacifier and all that junk. And I knew this guy for years. I used to sell him weed, and I go camping with him and hang out with him and all that stuff. He ended up getting in trouble with the law. I forget if he got caught with a bag or if it was a DUI or DWI or something. But the result was he ended up getting community service. Now, here in Texas, sometimes community service means picking up trash on the side of the highways and roads. Other times they give you a list of places you can volunteer at. In this case, he was assigned to pick up trash on the side of the road. And he comes by one afternoon to get a bag of weed. And he tells me he's going to be picking up trash the next day. And he's like, "Hey man, I need a favor." And he explains that in order to pick up trash, he shows up at the courthouse or whatever. And from there, the people from the county, they load them onto a truck or some kind of bus or something, some type of wheeled conveyance, and they take them to the place they'll be picking up trash. They drop them off, and then they come back several hours later to pick them up, maybe an hour or two later, take them somewhere else. And the expectation is that while they're gone, they should be picking up trash. So my buddy tells me the location where he's going to be picking up trash the next day. And it's the middle of the summer, and it's brutally hot. And he tells me he wants to get high while doing this work, but that he's super nervous about bringing weed in his pocket with him when he reports in to get driven to the site, and that he's unwilling to do it. He then explains to me that he'd like to roll some joints this afternoon while he's here with me, and then have me go and hide them in this specific utility box. I think it was like a water meter, or maybe it was like a control box for sprinklers or something, I don't know. And it was on the side of the road. And he's very specific about where this damn thing is located, so that he can get high the next day while picking up trash. That way all he needs to bring in his pocket is a lighter and his cigarettes. So, me being the stand-up homeboy that I am, I totally go and I execute on this mission, so that he can get high while doing his community service. He's then able to get high while picking up trash, and life is good for him, I guess. Now, normal people don't take these kind of risks to get and stay high. What if they came to pick him up and he smelled like weed? Or what if someone driving by saw him smoking and reported it? Or what if the other people picking up trash got jealous that he wouldn't share and they tattled on him? The list of potential negative situations coming from this goes on and on. So, yet again, fifth story, normal people don't have stories like this. They don't allow their use to drive them to these extents. All right. So that wraps up volume 1 of Normal People Don't Have Stories Like This. What do you guys think? Are these types of stories universal? Do other people who struggle with addiction have ones that are equally abnormal to the normies? If you can relate to this content and you're on iTunes, please take a moment to give me a rating and write a review under the ratings and review section. If you're watching on YouTube, comment, like, subscribe, all that. This is also available on Spotify. If you have feedback for me, comments, things you'd like me to discuss, people I should consider interviewing, whatever you got, feel free to shoot me an email at selfinflictedrrl@gmail.com. Also, shout out to Doug Snyder. He helps with sound production on a bunch of this stuff, and in this case helped by teaching me about editing and all that kind of thing. So much appreciated there. Thanks everyone for listening. Louie out.